Good evening and welcome everyone to a webinar on ranked choice voting sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. I'm LWVMA Executive Director Meryl Kessler, and I'm joined on this webinar by our presenter, Adam Friedman, Executive Director of Voter Choice Massachusetts, a nonpartisan, politically diverse, nonprofit organization dedicated to educating the Massachusetts public about electoral reforms that increase the range of choice on the ballot and produce fair outcomes. So before Adam begins his presentation, let me explain the mechanics of how this webinar will work. On your screen, you should see the first of Adam's slides for his presentation. Because we have over 100 people participating on this webinar, we have muted all of you to prevent background noise and interruptions. After I introduce Adam, he will begin his talk, which should run for about a half hour. We will allow him to finish before we take questions. There are two ways you can ask questions on this webinar. The first way is to type a question into the chat box. To do that, you hover your cursor over the black bar at the bottom of the screen and click on chat. You will type your question into the box and I will read it to Adam, who will then answer it. The second way you can ask a question is to raise your hand. To raise your hand, again, go to the black bar at the bottom of the screen, click on Raise Your Hand, and I will be notified that your hand is raised. I will call on people who have raised their hands, unmute you, and then you can speak. Please be sure the audio is enabled on your computer if you want to speak. As I said earlier, if you're having technical problems, please type into the chat box and let us know and we will try to help you. So without further ado, let me introduce Adam. Adam Friedman is Executive Director of Voter Choice Massachusetts. In 2009, he served on the Executive Committee of a ranked choice voting statewide ballot question campaign in Massachusetts. He serves on the boards of Mass Vote and Common Cause Massachusetts, and has been involved in lobbying and organizing around various voting and democracy reforms for over 10 years. Adam works full-time as a civic technologist and web software engineer. Beginning in 2012, Adam created the first searchable public database of official election statistics on behalf of the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and 3 other US states. Adam lives in Somerville and holds a BA in history from Boston University. And now I'm going to turn it over to Adam. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Meryl, and thank you everyone for tuning in to this very important webinar. I want to amend my biography a little bit. I am not a full-time civic technologist anymore because I've been a full-time paid executive director for Voter Choice Massachusetts since October. The bio is from last year or a year and a half ago. Our organization really got going in November 2016. And we came with no bank account, no money, just 50 activists in a room that wanted to reform voting after something amazing happened in Maine, and that was the state that became the first state in US history to enact ranked choice voting statewide. And then went on to run this system twice last year. But it was from that early enactment that inspired us to look around and say, you know what, this reform could transform the political culture of this country, could provide voters with a way forward in an era of great political crisis, and really change the incentives of campaigning so that campaigning is done well with more positivity and civility, issues oriented, and create a government that is more accountable and more representative to all of us. So it was from that work that I still do the technology work, like the statewide database under the Secretary's office, but have transitioned to do this full time because it's too important, and we need to build a very large infrastructure to advance this to the point where on the C4 side, it can be enacted as law. So I'll kind of start there and jump right into the talk so that we get a really good expert understanding of ranked choice voting, what it's all about. So here's the outline for tonight. Meryl already aptly captured what our organization is all about. We're a single issue organization to upgrade our voting system to ranked choice voting. And I'm going to go into why. What is broken about our current election system, and then ranked choice voting and how it elegantly solves some of these major problems that we've been habituated to live through cycle after cycle. And then some research that goes into some of the scholarly observations and objective data points and evidence that highlight some of the very interesting benefits of this reform. And then more details about how we've been doing advancing this as a campaign. And then we'll do Q&A. So this pretty much reiterates what Meryl had already said. Nonprofit, very politically diverse. We have folks across the spectrum, liberal Democrats, progressive Democrats, moderate Democrats, Republicans, Trump supporters, Green Party members, Pirate Party members, and everything in between. A lot of independents as well. And so we're working for better voting. So the problem can be very, very aptly captured in this classic dilemma, this classic scenario. We all remember this race. It all came down to Florida in 2000. You had two major party frontrunners, George Bush, the Republican, Al Gore, the Democrat, Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate. It's a lot of folks, it's a painful moment. It's a confusing moment. It's a moment that the country kind of held its breath as the two frontrunners had a hair's difference in their vote count, 537 votes, where when you look at Ralph Nader, he had about 100,000 votes. And so it's pretty intuitive, but also backed up by the exit polls, that those Nader voters, would Nader have not entered the race, or if he had dropped out, a plurality of them would have voted for Gore. Most of them would have voted for Gore, some for Bush, and some not voting at all. But it's very clear from the numbers and from the common sense aspect that Nader played the role of what we like to call in American politics the spoiler. And here we at Voter Choice really don't like this label. It's pejorative. It's demonizing, and we all know what happened to Nader. He used to be a consumer rights hero on the cover of Newsweek, very famous, well-liked advocate. And after this election, he committed what we call political suicide. But Nader's not only a spoiler; he's also what was known as a kingmaker. So a kingmaker is a scenario where someone with relatively little power or popularity on the surface gets to actually have inordinate power over the outcome of the election. So Nader's the least popular candidate, yet he gets to de facto decide who wins. If he stays in the race, he siphons votes away from Gore, and he allows Bush to win, or he gives him a better shot at winning. And if he drops out, he allows Gore to consolidate what's really the majority will of Floridian voters, and win. And we see in this chart that a majority of voters wanted to move in a left direction in this particular case, but merely because Nader is in the race playing kingmaker, that didn't happen. And Nader being a kingmaker is also a big security vulnerability, that you can have someone with actually very little popularity have so much power over the course of the country, history of the country and of the world. And then another scenario is, so that's the spoiler dilemma, where it's a three-way contest. And this is what we call the crowded field dilemma, or the vote splitting dilemma, which you have when you count the candidates here in these early 2016 Republican primaries. You have 14 candidates, and the gentleman in the lower right corner was able to garner very early wins in those primaries, to the tune of 25 to 35% of the vote, which meant a majority of voters did not choose Donald Trump in those contests, but he was able to squeak by holding on to one passionate faction, even if most voters actually didn't want him. That is also a paradox, a perversion, and it shows how our voting system can fail spectacularly when there's more than two candidates. It works fine when there's two, but it really begins to break down and show perverse outcomes when there's more. So the Washington Post, you know, to put a fine point on that, talked about how because there were so many other options for those voters who really didn't like Trump, that the majority will was diffused among them. And that's a problem, that our voting system cannot handle more choice. And then in the general election, we have the usual pejorative and negative politics of pressuring candidates out of the race, literally saying that Stein spoiled the election for Hillary, Johnson and Stein helped to elect Donald Trump. Clinton supporters furious with Stein. She, quote unquote, took votes from Hillary. Just really aggressive blaming of people who just should have the right to run. If we're in a democracy, every candidate should be able to run. Voters should be able to vote for them freely. But on a rational level, it sets up a lot of problems that people recognize, but people feel there's no way out until now. So here's a primary example on the state level. This is an example where Martha Coakley, Steve Grossman, and Don Berwick were vying for the nomination from the Democratic Party. Coakley in 2010, you may recall, had ran for US Senate against Scott Brown and lost. She was a household name. She was well recognized around the state. She served ably as AG, but she had that problem. And so you had some strong challengers in Steve Grossman and Don Berwick. And when you put these breakaway candidates together, you get a pretty strong majority in the Democratic contest. And you have this issue in our primaries where the parties have trouble finding their soul, determining a majority winner in our current system. So you have these situations where just because there were two candidates, they may have, we're not saying they would have changed the outcome, but it raises the question, an important question. Did they change the outcome? So at a minimum, Coakley, who did end up winning, and we all know the result, she walked into the general election and Charlie Baker defeated her. It's better for a party, we would argue, to find its soul and ensure that the winner has a majority. And that majority often brings with it a stronger volunteer base, a better ability to fundraise, a show of strength to their opponent in the general election. And we don't have exit polling like we did with the 2000 in Florida, but we have some anecdotal observations here from Berwick supporters talking about an affinity for Grossman and Berwick supporters, Grossman supporters, their affinity for Berwick. And you see some quotes here that speak to that. Now let's get really local. This is looking at a dilemma with vote splitting among a racial justice frame among communities of common interests that want to get into the game and gain in political power. But once again, our system creates these perversions, these perverse outcomes. So this is the first year in 2013 that Boston was a people of color majority city. And you had a very diverse candidate pool that reflected that, a lot of Black and Latino candidates. But what happened? There were two white Irish men who ended up winning the top two in that two-round runoff. They went on to go to the final round. So right here, mathematically, the top two vote getters, their combined vote was 35%, which meant what percentage of voters did not choose those two winners? 65%. Why did this happen? You had candidates of color in the same race, splitting the vote. They hailed from Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, Jamaica Plain, and this was such a problem that the Boston Globe was actually they found out that the supporters of Charlotte Gullah-Ritchie, which is the leading candidate of color in the lower left corner, were getting together, talking about, how do we get John Barros and Felix Arroyo and folks to drop out to clear the field for her. And they said that this was an attempt to, quote, racially gerrymander the campaign, and that it's a disservice. And it's once again, it's a sad state of affairs that in the 21st century, not only are we pressuring good candidates to drop out, we're pressuring candidates from communities who historically have been disadvantaged, disenfranchised, shut out of our system. This is an era in American democracy where we need to open the field, welcome people from communities to run from those groups and make sure all voices are heard. But we have a zero-sum situation where well-meaning gatekeepers, they're trying to block people from entering the race and judging, you know, you're not strong enough, you're going to flip the results to folks who are not representative of us. And this same thing came up in the Suffolk County District Attorney race this past cycle. Fortunately, Rachel Rollins was strong enough, but there was pressure on Evandro and on Linda Champion to get out of the race, and it created some really bad news for the community, and it tears communities apart. So it's a zero-sum situation that a better voting system would actually flip the script on that. So we're already at 17 minutes in, so I'm going to start speeding things up here. This is the third congressional race. A lot of folks around the state saw the mess that this was. It resulted in the winner having 21.6% of the vote. So we rounded up to 22. That's 78% of voters that did not choose the winner. This is where New York Times covered us and said, you know, we have a quote there that this isn't really democracy if we can't have the majority. A very strong majority did not get their choice. And maybe Lori Trahan would have won anyhow in ranked choice voting, but we'll never know because our ballots are not expressive. That gives us more nuance and a more realistic model for how people actually think about candidates, which is in relative terms. It's not a one and done type of analysis. We may have an opinion about 3 or 4 candidates. Voters should have the right to express that on their ballot, and the ballot should really be more modernized. And so when you zoom out, when we look at this systemically, Massachusetts suffers from a dual-edged problem. On the one hand, we have the lowest competition for state house seats in the country. Among every other state, we are ranked 50th out of 50 for competitiveness of elections for state house office. But when there is competition, when there are 3 or more candidates in a race, rates at which people win without that majority mandate, which is symptomatic of vote splitting and spoilers, is incredibly high. Look at district attorney. In the last 20 years, 86% of 3+ candidate district attorney races resulted in someone who could not cobble together a majority mandate. And nearly half of state rep races and 1/3 of state senate races, both primaries and generals. So we blame voters, we blame candidates who want to run. We should be blaming the system. It's the plurality voting system that's spoiled, and it fails on many, many counts. All right, on to the big show here, the solution. So ranked choice voting is a very simple upgrade. It allows you to choose more than one candidate on your ballot. You rank them in the order you prefer them, rather than just picking one and praying. I call our current system the pick one and pray system. Here is a sample ranked choice voting ballot that was circulated in Maine to help educate voters in advance of their first election last year. And it's very, very simple and intuitive. You can't rank more than one candidate with the same ranking. That would be called an overvote, and your ballot would be returned to you to fill it out correctly. So you simply rank 1, 2, 3, or however many candidates there are. You can rank as many or as few as you like. So if you only like candidate 2, for instance, you rank them as your first choice, you fill in that bubble, and you can leave the rest blank if you'd like. Which indicates you can still vote the old way. You can still vote the way you vote now. No one is forced to vote differently if they don't want to. But as a voter, it's in your interest to maximize the power of backup choices and to maximize the expression of your ballot. So another way to explain this is ranked choice voting allows you to vote for your favorite candidate as your first choice, but then you get the benefit of backup choices in the event your first choice does not have the support to continue in the way that the winner is determined. And I'm going to go into that in a second. So Meryl, I don't know if you want to jump into questions now or we'll do it at the very end.
I think we'll wait till the end. Why don't you keep on going?
Okay, so let's find out how a ranked choice voting winner is determined. So this is really important. Ranked choice voting is not a scoring system or a rating system. People aren't awarded points based on the rankings. It's an instant runoff. So most people understand what runoffs are already. You have 2 rounds. You have one round where everyone runs, and then you lop off everybody but the top 2, and then you run a second election, and voters have to turn out again to pick among the top 2. This is the same paradigm, but it's done instantly in a single election. And the candidates that are peeled away one by one, rather than lopping off the vast majority of them, which still causes vote splitting and spoilage, which just happened, as I showed you, in the 2013 Boston mayoral race, and is part of why the top 2 open primary system in California has a lot of problems, because there's spoiling going on all the time. So this is the same principle, but it's done in a more intelligent way that ensures that every vote is counted and every voter is enfranchised and is heard because of the power of backup choices. So here's how it's done. You only count the first choice votes first. You don't look at the rankings after every ballot is submitted. And if any candidate has more than 50%, has a majority of first choice votes, the election is over. They are declared the winner. Now, where ranked choice voting is so critical is when we're counting those first choice votes and no candidate has a majority. Now we enter into the instant runoff. And that's a simple process of eliminating the lowest vote getter. Those voters get their ballot counted for their next choice because their favorite is gone. They're eliminated. And that way their voice is always heard and is never wasted. And so let's look at our example here. We have 2 orangey candidates and 2 purpley candidates, strong orange, weak orange, strong purple and weak purple. We look at the round 1 of the instant runoff. No candidate has a majority of first choice votes. We eliminate the weakest, we eliminate the lowest vote getter. For the purposes of our example, we're saying we're gonna walk through this as if those weak orange voters that voted weak orange first all wanted an orangey candidate, so they all voted strong orange second, which in reality wouldn't happen typically. There'd be like a 3% on strong orange, maybe a 1% and a 1% on the purple candidates. But this just makes the math really easy to follow. So these weak orange candidates, we eliminate weak orange, we add their second choices to whoever those voters wanted second, in this case, bold orange. And then we check again, does any candidate have a majority? No. No candidate has a majority. So what do? We do the exact same thing we just did. We eliminate the weakest, and we transfer those votes to those voters' backup choice so that everyone's voice is heard. And this time, the lowest vote getter is weak purple. So those are purpley voters who want to move in a purple direction. And in our example, 100% of them are ranking bold purple as their second choice. In reality, there'd be a few that go over to orange, but the concept here is clear. Now we look in round 3. Does anyone have a majority? Yes. So it's bold purple. Strong purple actually is the winner under ranked choice. If you look only at round 1, let's back that up. The winner in a plurality election, a pick one and pray system, would be bold orange. But look how the 2 purple candidates begin to converge under ranked choice voting. In plurality voting, the true will of the majority gets buried in a split vote. But in ranked choice voting, the true expression of the electorate as a whole can emerge because there's more data and more expression on the ballot. It's a very important principle. And that's one reason why ranked choice voting is such an elegant way to get more accurate representation in our democracy and ensure that every candidate and voter who wants to participate can do so to the full extent they're able. So when we apply ranked choice voting to something like the 2000 Florida election, Nader voters can put Nader as their first choice, Gore as their second, or Bush as their second. It's totally up to that voter. Nader gets eliminated because no one has a majority. Then his voters' votes transfer their second choice, and the rest is history. Bernie Sanders could have run as the independent that he was his whole career in the general election in 2016. Imagine how different that election would have been with Bernie's particular platform adding to the debate, enriching the debate, and maybe moving us a little away from the politics of mutual assured destruction that we observed with Trump and Hillary going back and forth, attacking each other's character and ethics and all of the rest of it. Bernie, we do know that there were 2 million voters who happened to be Democratic enrolled voters that did not show up in 2016 that did vote in 2012. So it would be interesting to see how that would have changed. And one of the number one drivers of turnout are good campaigns. People turn out to vote for someone. They vote for a vision. So imagine if Bernie's particular vision was in that race, it would have changed a lot about that election, not only the outcome, but the tone and tenor of it, and the ability for the electorate to get really energized and excited. Now we're coming up with another presidential cycle. And we tell folks, you can either get Schultzed or you can get ranked choice voting. The choice is clear. And it's important and urgent that we have a voting system that allows an independent to run who wants to run without being labeled, demonized as spoiler, without flipping the outcome to someone that the majority does not want to go with. So this is an example where if we had ranked choice voting for the presidential, those independent voters could safely and rationally vote for Schultz, and then they can render their second choice to whomever they like as a backup if Schultz does get eliminated. And then, of course, voters in the Boston mayoral could have voted in a cluster for candidates that reflected their particular backgrounds and communities. And then the second big benefit, when you run this to replace this two-round runoff system, you save the city money. Every city in Massachusetts uses the two-round runoff to select mayor and often their city council. And this is a really great way for them to save money and boost voter turnout at the same time, and shorten campaign cycles as well, which allows folks from disadvantaged backgrounds and more women to run and wage a strong campaign and contend for representation. So there's some really great benefits here with ranked choice voting: eliminate spoilers and vote splitting, encourage more folks to run, bring more positive campaigns, and provide more voice and choice to voters. I'll breeze through where it's used. We're coming up on time. Maine became the first state in U.S. history to enact ranked choice voting. And then Maine held their first ranked choice voting election in June, and then another one in the general in November. And we'll get into some details there. It's used all over the country. It's actually used in 21 U.S. states at various levels, but it's used in over 12 cities, and now in Benton County as well. And there's a number of places where it's awaiting first usage. Benton County, Oregon, and which passed the same year Maine did. And it's awaiting first usage in a number of cities, including Amherst. And East Hampton is also seriously considering switching over. So it's really exciting because we have a lot of great data from these cities, and nearly 4 million Americans live in communities that use ranked choice voting today. It also should be noted it's been used in 5 states for their congressional runoffs, in particular for military and overseas voters to participate, because the time it takes to send ballots for both rounds of those runoffs is so long that instead they have those voters pre-select their second choice on the ballot so that they can be rendered during the final top 2 and be enfranchised for the 2 rounds. It's a very interesting implementation of ranked choice. It's been used around the world, in Australia for over a century for national elections, in Ireland for nearly a century to elect its president and some other national offices, in India to elect its president indirectly through the Indian Congress, and the UK and Canada and New Zealand across the board at provincial and local levels. It's used to select Best Picture with the Oscars. It's used in over 50 colleges and universities around the country, and just lists upon lists of professional organizations, including the National Organization for Women. Now, our current system incentivizes candidates to go negative. Your job as a candidate in our current paradigm is to get just a few more votes above your strongest opponent. And so a way to do that is to beat down that strongest opponent. That's just the way it's done. And it's an unfortunate incentive that is baked into our primitive plurality system. Ranked choice voting changes that paradigm completely. There's anecdotal evidence and scholarly observational data that shows that candidates behave differently under ranked choice voting. So San Francisco East Bay Times observed this, talking about candidates even campaigning together and trying to win the goodwill of each other's supporters. And in Minneapolis, the mayoral campaign, candidates knew that they had to stay positive so as not to alienate each other's supporters, so they wouldn't lose those second choice votes. And if there wasn't I don't know what would be a better poster child for ranked choice voting than candidates coming together, holding hands and singing Kumbaya after a debate. We do have the video. It's too corny for me to even show it, but it's pretty funny. And I don't know if we want to go that far with our elections, but it's certainly a refreshing break from the politics of division that we're so accustomed to. So why the dynamic here is clear. When you campaign under plurality, let's say you support a purple candidate and you come to a home where there's a sign for the orange candidate. In our current paradigm, what do you do in that situation? You leave, you skip the door, you go to another household. So you just don't talk to those voters. But with ranked choice voting, you go to the door, you have a conversation with that voter, and you can appeal to a common interest, and you're incentivized to go as broad as you can because you want to pick up second and third choice votes in order to win a majority. The number one thing you don't do is start slamming their favorite. If you start, making aspersions about their character, they cheated on their spouse, they're unethical, the rumor mill, they're not going to put you second and third. So you stick to the issues and you find common ground. And Betsy Hodges in Minneapolis has a great video that folks can click through after we share this slideshow with you and hear her talk about her experience with that. But more importantly, the objective studies that have shown that voters actually experience less campaign negativity, and they see candidates spending less time criticizing one another and more time focused on their vision for moving the community forward. So here we have non-ranked choice voting cities observing, 25% of them observing candidates going negative a great deal of the time, and only 5% in ranked choice voting cities seeing the same thing. Now, a common myth is that ranked choice voting is complicated, that voters are not going to understand it. Let's look at the data. So first of all, when you compare ranked choice voting elections to runoff elections, you have on average a 10% higher turnout across the board. And when you look at this problem of overvotes and undervotes, all these errors on the ballot, there is statistically no significance in differences in error rates between plurality ballots and ranked choice. They are practically identical. And you look at city after city and in the state of Maine as well, and you'll see the same thing. So it's really exciting for folks who intuitively think, oh, there's more going on, there's more independent, there's more information, voters are already low information, they're not turning out, they don't understand. It's just not true, and it's a condescending, specious argument. The data shows otherwise, and we don't need to argue it in theory, we have the evidence. So here's some of that evidence. Voters are using the rankings to full effect. 87% of voters in Maine's first ever ranked choice voting primary for the Democratic primary used the rankings. And same with San Francisco, their mayoral race. In San Francisco, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which began using this last year for the first time, 88% of voters used the rankings, and get this, 61% of voters ranked all 5 candidates for mayor. That is deep civic engagement. And so could it be that the ranked ballot actually creates an incentive for voters to engage more deeply because they have the opportunity to do so and render real political power in that more expressive format? So we'll see as more research is done to validate that hypothesis, but it's quite intriguing. Ranked choice voting has been shown in a statistically significant way to empower more people of color to run and to win office, and as well as more women to do the same. So when you look at cities that have used ranked choice voting, this is, when you're looking at women's representation, let's take that up. These are the showings of women's representation when you compare it to the orange bar, which is the national average, 25% women versus men on these councils. In all of these cities, we have much higher rates of women's share. And a lot of these cities in the lower right, you'll see that most of these are majority people of color cities by a long shot. So these are cities that are having great success with representation, with voter understanding, that have more women and people of color winning office. This is just kind of another way to show that. And then when we look at this longitudinally, when we look at the phase of cities that that do or do not adopt ranked choice voting over time, over the same time periods, the same number of elections, and the same election cycles, we find that with cities that do adopt ranked choice voting, you have a great jump in people of color winning, which is the left-hand chart, and women winning, which is the right-hand chart, when you compare to those cities in the same time period that did not adopt ranked choice voting. And there's some excellent, again, you can click through and I'll send a study that goes into more detail about that across hundreds of elections with these cities. Now let's look at cost. The Secretary of Maine, the Chief Elections Officer, was not a great friend to ranked choice voting in the beginning. He argued, his office estimated that it would cost them $1.5 million additional dollars to implement this statewide. And they estimated that less than half of voters would even use the rankings. Well, we already saw the data that shows that 87% of voters used the rankings. So he was wrong on that count, and he was wrong on the cost count too. It cost Maine a whopping $110,000 to implement ranked choice voting statewide. And now the Secretary of Maine is a hero. He goes and does webinars and talks all over the country to show off that he was the first in the country to pull this off, to implement it. And he did it at low cost, and it was very smooth operationally. So that's a really good signal and should embolden other state governments and secretaries to take a look at upgrading their voting to ranked choice voting for their state. And we're working very hard on that. Now we're actually meeting with the Secretary's office to discuss this in a couple of weeks. So our cost estimate, this is actually kind of out of date. It's likely going to be under $3 million, even for the first year, but we don't have to get into details now. We can do Q&A there. Okay, so ranked choice voting and its progress in Massachusetts, and we'll wrap up in 2 minutes. So that'll be a 40-minute talk. Sorry about that. I hope this was interesting so far. But now this is my favorite part. This is where we get into winning, winning enactment, winning this for state law and moving our country forward. So we began, and once the visionary patriots in Maine enacted this by the ballot in November 2016, I called our first meeting. We had 54 people come out, and we got to work. We started organizing, and eventually we built quite a large organization. One of the hottest issues being discussed on Beacon Hill, and there's buzz all across the political spectrum on this issue now, where in fact Massachusetts is the largest and most active statewide effort for ranked choice voting in the nation today. And we have 9 regional chapters set up with their own volunteers and a couple of staff that are managing those. And they do their own events and own activities. And we have grown that I had a tiny list of 200 reform-minded folks. We've grown that to over 25,000 supporters today, nearly 5,000 volunteer signups. We've raised money. We've gone from $0, no bank account. We've raised almost $700,000, over 1,600 individual donors. And I think we just got our average donation is something like $40-something. And it's really exciting. People are putting their money where their mouths are. They see that we have a winning strategy. They see that this is an urgent need for the country. It's a nonpartisan reform. And people are coming to it, flocking to it, and we're really excited about where we're going to go with this. And we've been hiring staff and building a professional campaign shop on the C4 side. And there's talk of a ballot measure potentially in 2020 if the legislature does not act to pass a bill. But to lay the groundwork for political enactment, you've got to do a lot of work. You've got to get a lot of endorsements on your side, as well as just build your numbers and your capacity. So one key endorsement was that of the strongest political party in the state by a long shot, Democratic Party. We had 2 minutes on the floor, and we got the party to put ranked choice voting onto their platform 2 years ago. And ever since, that's been really helpful in opening a lot of doors. 80% of state house seats are occupied by Democrats, and 100% of our congressional delegations. It's obviously critical to do that work. Secretary Galvin himself tweeted out in June of 2018 of last year, after watching what happened, the spectacular success in Maine, that it's time for our state to come together to implement ranked choice voting. So we're looking forward to our meeting with them, with his office next month, and to work hand in hand to create a plan to roll this out in a smooth way. The Boston Globe has 3 times issued editorials that are glowing endorsements of ranked choice voting. We encourage you to go online and find those and read this on the slideshow. They're big fans, and there's in addition to them, there's over 265 media hits we've earned over the last couple of years with no paid help with that, no media strategy, but they're hearing the call that this is an urgent need, and they're writing it up and broadcasting the message. And then we have a number of organizations that have endorsed ranked choice voting. The League of Women Voters of Massachusetts have had the old name for this, instant runoff voting, on the Where We Stand document beginning in 2005. And a number of other organizations have come on since and endorsed. And you'll see on the right, we have some elected officials, 3 members of Congress. Steve Grossman is actually on our advisory board, and a number of other folks. Some of these candidates are quite out of date, so we're going to remove those. We have had an incredible showing with the State House effort this year. The session began in January. We got to work the co-sponsorship period. When that expired for the House, we ended up with 82 co-sponsors for our 2 bills. That is 41% of the State House signing on to make ranked choice voting enacted as law. We are doing a 200 Coffees campaign to continue to engage those legislators to reach 70% State House support by May. To go back to these bills, one would institute ranked choice voting for all state and federal elections. At this time, we're excluding the office of the president because we think that should be a conversation that's had nationally. Even though obviously it's a very compelling case, but you need a lot of states doing it for it to be very impactful, particularly swing states where you're going to have vote splitting, which you likely won't have in Massachusetts. So we're going to focus on getting this in place for lower offices, get voters used to it, and then help with a national effort. And then we have our local option bill, which lets cities and towns try out ranked choice voting on their own. It's simply enabling it, does not force them to do anything. It gives them the option to switch to it for their local elections. And so both of these bills are very important, but the first one is certainly our flagship bill that is urgently needed now. So this is our lobbying campaign. If the legislature does not act, we're prepared to move toward ballot measure and put this question to voters in November of 2020. So that's going to be a huge effort, and we would absolutely appreciate any support across, list building, donating, and endorsements gathering that folks can provide if you're interested in helping make that a reality and moving, making national waves. That's really the exciting moment and opportunity that we have. So this is just a lot of kind of inside baseball. Here's the strategy for how to do this. We don't have to get into now. Here's some opportunities for action as we wrap up. I'm a little bit over time here. Sign up immediately for emails at voterchoicema.org. Do some canvassing at an event, run a table, sign up new supporters, build that list, make calls to mobilize the thousands and thousands of people that are on our list that are waiting to hear from us to figure out how to really keep moving this forward. Host a house party, raise awareness and raise funds for us. That would be really exciting. And we have a lot of fun. We do demo elections with desserts or wines or beer or whatever you like, costumes, music. The sky's the limit. We'll teach everybody an interactive ranked choice voting election and watch how the votes transfer and we pick a majority winner. Or really take leadership in your community. Join a chapter, become a team lead, or start a new chapter that we don't have yet in Massachusetts. So with that, thank you so much for your great patience as I prattled on for 45 minutes, and I will rest my voice for a minute and start taking questions as Meryl can give them.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam. That was a really terrific, informative, data-rich presentation, and I'm sure everybody found it quite interesting. We do have some questions in the chat box, and participants should feel free to type additional questions in the chat box. So here's the first one. Assume that I'm a bad actor. I know that those who share my politics are in the minority, and the only way I can hold on to power is to play the two candidates game. So I do all I can to oppose ranked choice voting. How do you defeat me?
So I'd like to have a dialogue with this person. You do all you can to oppose ranked choice voting. Is this before we've enacted it? Is this like a political strategy question? Or is this after we have ranked choice voting, it's in place, a theoretical or a hypothetical situation?
The person hasn't typed a follow-up, but let's assume it sounds to me like it's before ranked choice voting is in place. So how do you overcome opposition to it from people who don't want to give up political power and don't think that they could hold on to power?
Yeah. So the job of a good campaign is to create so much public momentum and perception that this is an important common sense thing. It's a no-brainer, and there's a lot of popular support for it, that you create a chilling effect on those who want to stump against it, and they feel they will alienate and marginalize themselves by doing so. So there's lots, candidates get in the game and they have lots of ideas and they disagree, as they should. So we're not going to win everyone over, but what we can do is ensure that we go through and pressure the candidates to get on board and make sure that they support it, by mobilizing the grassroots effort around it. And then that really, even if someone comes out against it, it's fine. It's just going to make them look bad, and they probably won't win the election, or it's going to hurt their candidacy. So it's kind of like basic campaign strategy.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So we have a couple of questions that are really on the same topic, which is, if we have ranked choice voting, do we need to get all new voting equipment, or can we use the voting equipment we have?
That's a good question. So the most popular optical scan machine that we have, so we use the optical scan, we don't have touch screens, they're banned in our state, which is a good thing from integrity security perspective. The most popular model is called the AccuVote OS, and that's a system that's 10 to 15 years old at this point. They're all being replaced. They're due for an upgrade within a couple of years anyhow. And then there's the Optech Eagle machines. The Optech Eagles need to be replaced, but there's only about 80 of them left, and there's hundreds of the AccuVotes. And so the AccuVotes can, with their existing software, can be used to run ranked choice voting. So the only machines that really need to be replaced are the Optech Eagles. And so that shouldn't cost more than $1 million. So that should be some very good news. Now, even that price tag is already paid for, because we have in our state a bank account of what's called federal money. It's called the Help America Vote Act of 2002. That was designated money for election technology to help upgrade voting machines and lists and polling books and workflows. We have $50 million in a bank account that Galvin controls right now. So if we need that, we can tap a fraction of that to completely absorb the cost of any kind of upgrade.
Great, thanks, Adam. The next question is Cambridge's system of local voting for school committee and city council exactly the same as the ranked choice voting system you just explained?
So the Cambridge system, the only similarity is that they do use ranked ballots, but there's a big difference. Cambridge uses ranked choice voting, a variant called proportional representation. Now that is a system where you elect multiple seats at the same time. So their city council is a 9-seat city council. So those 9 seats are open every 2 years. And you have a big old ballot where there could be 2 or 3 challengers per seat, which means you have a lot of candidates to choose from. And so that can be a lot of information for voters. And then it's counted in kind of a different way, where you first have surplus votes and then you start eliminating until each candidate reaches the 10% threshold to get a seat. It's actually a really exciting system in its own right, and it would actually enfranchise a lot of small minority groups, like in Lowell, where you have 51% white majority that consistently sweeps their 9-seat city council with all white candidates, even though a near majority is Cambodian or Latino when you combine those populations. So Lowell is actually getting sued because they don't have a proportional system. So that actually would solve that problem. However, in our campaign, we're focusing only on the simpler single winner instant runoff ranked choice voting variant to ensure that voters are used to it, can learn about it and understand it quickly and get used to using the ranked ballot. And then there may be a campaign down the road where people revisit this for multi-seat implementations.
Thanks, Adam. So we have another couple of questions that really touch on the same issue, which are the arguments against ranked choice voting. One question specifically asks, what are those arguments? And another question states or queries, how can I convince my state rep to support ranked choice voting? This was his response when I emailed him, and this is the quote from the state rep. After consultation with the town clerk and others, I believe the proposal brings with it the chance for more error and fraud on a number of fronts at a time when the general public has doubts about the process. So that was one argument that one person has made against it, but maybe you can talk about other arguments and how to respond to them.
Certainly. Well, let's take that one first. So, you know, so you can say lots of things about something that you haven't had experience with, or you haven't looked at the data or evidence around it. And people read and they infer a lot of things when they hear about it for the first time. Error rates is one of those things that I hope that I've shown, at least with the initial data that you've observed, is a myth. And you look at the data from those other cities, and it's easily dispelled as a myth. That voters engage fully with this. The error rates are the same. And even if a voter screws up and overvotes because there's a grid of bubbles to deal with, that the optical scan machines can spit that back and give them the opportunity to cast the ballot correctly. So when you look at the data, that's just not, there's no there in terms of that argument. And then when you're talking about voter fraud, the problem of fraud does crop up in our current elections. Ranked choice voting doesn't change that at all. And it's actually really important that voters have an auditable paper trail of any ballot, any anonymous private ballot that we can. And that's just not happening in Massachusetts. And we have a very limited implementation of post-election audits to ensure that the final count does reflect the precinct counts. And the same thing could and should happen with ranked choice voting. We would propose the ability for us to see ballots as public record so that any third party, any disinterested third party institution or group of citizens can open them up and do their own audit and recount in a reasonable time frame and at reasonable cost. So that's a universal problem that ranked choice voting really wouldn't exacerbate it in any way. And to the other questions of what would be criticisms, I think the fact that it's complicated, or the argument that it's complicated, is definitely the number one most common thing that comes up. And once again, I think I've shown data that dispels that. I'm trying to think of, I'm trying to be coy, I just can't think of other arguments. But if folks bring more, feel free. I mean, there's other more esoteric things, like there's a lot of alternative voting system proposals in the academic world. They all have these mathematical properties. So some who like approval voting or score voting or range voting or Buckland or Condorcet think ranked choice voting is inferior to those. But that's a little bit subjective because you have to look at which mathematical properties you value. But that's really getting in the weeds of the nerd stream in the academy. So we don't have to get into that here, but I welcome folks to explore that if they're interested.
So let me, with the time we have left, and I apologize to folks if we didn't get to your question. We have a lot of questions in the box. I've been trying to get the sense of the group and go with the topics that most people seem to be interested in. But if you have other questions, you can certainly get in touch with Adam directly through Voter Choice Massachusetts to ask your questions. But in the time left, why don't we take one more question from the box, and then there are a couple of hands raised, and we can go to one of those. What?
Meryl, if I could cut in, I'm for folks on the call. I'm happy to, even if Meryl has to log off, I'm happy to stay on with extended time to address the questions, and maybe Meryl can like send me the whole list up front if she can't remain. But that's just
Yep. Okay, that sounds good. So there was a question here about strategy, about your strategy. And the question is, why gamble with the ballot question? Why not just concentrate on passing the necessary legislation?
great question. Passing legislation would certainly be cheaper from a money standpoint. But on the other hand, if we're asking voters, if we're asking to change the voting system, it's really important that we ask voters to do it. So I think that we're actually going to be in a much stronger position by ensuring that we have really broad public proof that voters want to do this, want to move in this direction. That's why a ballot question makes a much stronger statement. It also strengthens our ability to defend the law when enacted. If you just pass it with a bill or you pass some watered down version of it or what have you, the legislature can still attack it later. Even if it, as a ballot question, the legislature, they're not above trying to attack it. Clean elections, the campaign finance law that voters passed 2-1 in 1998. The Democratic-controlled state house actually started to defund and repeal it only 6 years later. So that's, we're not putting anything off the table in terms of what's possible, the lowest of the lows in terms of what our legislature is capable of. So yeah, we just think it's a much better national statement and a stronger state statement to do ballot.
Actually, let me just couple more from the box that are there's
Sure.
a series of questions about what offices will be covered by ranked choice voting. So can senator and congressional candidates be voted on through ranked choice voting at the state level?
So the main proposal was U.S. Senate, U.S. House, which is Congress, governor, state Senate, state rep, primaries and generals for the federal offices, and then primaries only for the state offices. Our proposal would be primaries and generals for all of those offices, all the executive branch state level offices like treasurer, attorney general, et cetera, and then state legislature for sure. And then on down the ballot, there's a lot of races that are reported to the state secretary, which would be covered. That would be district attorney, register of probate, register of deeds, some county offices, things like that.
Terrific. Adam, I think what I'd like to do now is go to one of the hands that's been raised. I don't think, as generous as your offer was to stay on, I think we're going to have to, we're recording this, and I think we're going to have to just shut everything down at the hour mark. But can you share out an email or contact information where people can reach you if they want to ask you directly? One of their questions, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Sure, you can email, so I'll give you two emails. One is our general mailbox, info@voterchoicema.org, and I'll see that, and some other folks will see that, info@voterchoicema.org. If you want to write me personally, that's fine, adam@voterchoicema.org.
Okay, that's pretty easy. And just so everyone knows, we've gotten a few questions in the chat box about sending out these materials after the webinar, and we will send out both a recording of this webinar and Adam's PowerPoint so people can have that and share it with others. And at the same time, we can also send out contact information for Adam if you have further questions or just want to get involved. So you'll know how to reach him. Okay, let's just go to one of the hands that are raised. Linda Friedman, I'm going to give you the last question. And
go for
it. Oops, Linda, I'm getting a message that you are using an older version of Zoom. Hold on.
Uh,
Let's see if we can get you on. Trying a little technical fix here. Linda, try speaking, and you have to unmute yourself. Linda?
I hear something.
Okay. While we're seeing if Linda can ask her last question, let me ask you one last question then from the chat box. And by the way, lots of accolades coming in over the chat box. So one question, and you touched on this briefly in your presentation, had to do with using ranked choice voting to elect the president. Someone wants to know what would have to happen for us to have a ranked choice voting system to elect the president.
That's great. So the quickest way to get a big impact at the level of presidency would be for a swing state to enact this for their own selection of the president and the electors going toward the winner of that state. That's really where we're seeing this crisis of vote splitting, right? It's the swing states that you have these so-called spoiler candidates flipping the results. And then that in turn, delivers crucial electoral votes to the quote unquote wrong winner, or the person who really didn't have majority support in that state and maybe even nationally. So that would be the quickest way. The more kind of broad-based, like make a national, revolutionize the culture of our politics nationally way would be to either have a president-only campaign that was a national organization that ran a national conversation on that issue, convince the major parties that this was even good for them because their primaries can pick better results, and the general will have a fairer result for whoever really the best person was for the winner. The second way to do it is state by state, deep ranked choice voting engagement, get it into the DNA of each state with enough capital, funding support, and the right messaging to move this, distribute the power and promise of this broadly among the psychology of and the zeitgeist of the voters. You could do it that way. And so we're kind of leaning toward that latter approach. And there are plans to transform voter choice MA into voter choice US, or a national unified front. So I want folks to keep that in mind as well, that this really needs to be national. And we're proving through the playbook that we've built in Massachusetts that it can be, if it can be done here, it can be done anywhere. That's really an important point. And so if you were to contribute to the effort, that would be really, we're trying to see around that corner and make this a huge, ambitious, bold and visionary campaign for the country. So we could talk more.
Well, that seems like the perfect place to end off a bold, optimistic statement. So I just want to, on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts, thank Adam for this really informative, thought-provoking, comprehensive presentation. I think everybody got a lot out of it and enjoyed it. Participants should look for an email from us tomorrow that, as I said, will have the PowerPoint and the webinar and also contact information for Adam. And thank you all for participating, and thank you, Adam, once again for joining us.
It was an honor to present to the statewide league. Thank you so much, Meryl, for having me.
Thank you. Okay, good night, everyone.